Well, my background is, I've had a lot of different careers. My latest career was professor. I was a full professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and I'm now retired. So I'm doing all spiritual work. My topic was communication. And once I retired, I started focusing on spirit communication. And this book is a combination of my spirit work and my professional work on visual spirituality. It is an academic book. It does have all of the footnotes and all of that lengthy stuff that you have to do as an academic. But in addition to being an academic, I also have a certificate from the Spiritualist National Union. So I am a medium. I've been in mediumship and speaking. So I've got their certificate, CSNU. So with that said, I am a medium and also an artist. And so I put it all together in this presentation. It's called Visual Spirituality. And just to give you a little bit of the academic kind of background on it, we have found that philosophical, social, historical, and technological factors, they've all influenced our concepts of modern art. And during the 20th century, spiritual and religious beliefs were not widely acknowledged. In fact, none of these artists were generally acknowledged in art history as being spiritual at all. Secularization theory, which is a theory that understood as the decline of the scope of religious authority and social significance. So what we find is that what's happened is that materialization has become the dominant factor in culture. So the spiritual is greatly missing on all levels, not just the art. And we look at the art, or they started to look at the art as an expression, a representation of the material world, which totally altered the emphasis that the artists had on their spiritual backgrounds. But we know that religious and art have always been a part of the human experience since the beginning of time. Primitive art, when we look at the cave paintings and drawings, they were mystical rather than aesthetic. And we know that the images were trying to depict all kinds of mystical religious rites. And this is in stark contrast to lots of culture today, which considers art a commodity, which is starting to change a little bit. So there's two parts to this presentation. As I said, the earliest recorded images were grounded in ritual and mystical experience. Just to let you know, my difference from art history is that I'm interested in what the artists wanted to communicate in the work and how they tried to influence not only art and art history, but also culture. Because you'll see that many of the modern artists thought that through art, we could have a better culture. And they also worked with psychic awareness, automatic drawing, physical mediumship, spirit guides, and of course, some of them worked with deceased artists. And to start our trip into spiritualistic art, we're going to start with the Hudson River School. Now, the Hudson River School was influenced by the beautiful landscapes of America and the New World. And one of their things was luminism, and luminism was about the light. The Hudson River School itself was started by Thomas Cole. He was originally born in England and came to the United States. They used to paint all of the landscapes up and down the eastern seaboard, all around the Hudson River area in New York, but they also expanded up into New England and all around. And what they would do is they would go outside and paint live landscapes during the summer and fall, and then they would bring all their sketches back into the studio and paint these elaborate, beautiful landscape paintings. This is one by Frederick Church. It is Niagara Falls. That's one of their topics that they were favorite. Several people have done that. And they also started to go not only on the East Coast, but they started to venture out into the West and the Midwest. An interesting thing about the Hudson River School is that they welcomed female artists. There were a number of female artists that are associated with the school. These women were usually relatives of the artists, sisters, nieces, that type of thing. And they actually show their paintings at that time, as well as the men. They usually showed in different art galleries, but they did show their work, and some did make a living from it. Sarah Cole was the sister of Thomas Cole. Evelina Mount was another one of the Hudson River School artists. And what we have to say, which is really interesting about them, is remember all that heavy Victorian clothing they used to wear? These women would go outside in the corsets, in the heavy stuff, in the heat, in the summer, and they would wear this stuff. Eventually, they got to the point where they started to modify the dress a little bit so they could go out trekking into the landscapes with the men. Evelina Mount was the niece of William Sidney Mount. Now, Mount is very, very important because not only was he a medium, he also studied spiritualism his whole life. He was based on Long Island, New York. He is best known probably for his paintings of very happy, jolly African Americans who were playing instruments. These are the ones they usually show of his in the museums. However, he also did paint a spirit picture of Rembrandt that was done in the style that Rembrandt would have drawn. So he had a lot of mediumistic abilities and went to seances. Luminism, which came slightly after the Hudson River School, was known for its light, and the spiritual essence of these were the fact that the light had a spiritual quality to it. For the Hudson River School, landscapes represented God and godliness. So all of those pictures were a representation of spirit and faith. And these did some more with the lights that they used, the coloring light. Shortly after the Hudson River School, we have Adam Pinker Ryder. Ryder is very important too because he was a spiritual person. He worked with psychometry. He worked with vibrations. He put layers and layers and layers of paint on a canvas and believed that people viewing the canvas could experience the vibrations from the paint and the people. In this particular image, he used a lot of biblical scenes. He shows a materialization of Jesus in front of a woman. But of course, art historians would never put it into that context. Ryder really painted emotions, and it should be known that around these times too, Ledbetter and Besant came up with the idea of thought forms, and thought forms were taking emotional human experiences and depicting them in visualizations and visual elements. And the thought forms greatly influenced a lot of the artists coming after Pinker. Two artists also from the 1800s, Wella and Pet Anderson. These are two artists that have not been recognized by art history, and they needed to have more research done on them. Wella and Pet they worked with pencils, and what they would do is magnetize the paper, and then they would draw spirit guides of different people, spirit guides from Atlantis and different places. They also did portraits of people's loved ones in the spirit world. And many Americans at the time had their pictures in their homes. So they were well known during their time, but not well remembered today. Georgiana Houghton, moving on to England. Georgiana Houghton has just been rediscovered recently. There have been a number of exhibits of her work. There are a few of her pictures that have survived. They actually, in Australia, believe it or not. And the art has been described as a blurring and fusion between art and religion. Her work was like anything seen before in Victorian times. She started by becoming a medium after her sister was killed or died. She got interested in spiritualism. She started working as a medium. She started with table tipping. She started with the planchette. And through the planchette, she started to create these drawings of hers. And so her work is very influenced. It didn't influence exactly the abstract expressionist because nobody knew about her. But her work was all pre-abstract expressionism. So they're having to look at her as kind of the first person who did it. This is a little more of Georgina Houghton's work. Notice the squiggly lines on it. She also would write descriptions on the back of some of them of what the spiritual meaning and significance of the art was. Along the lines of Georgina Houghton, Hilma af Klint, go here, oh, what did I do? There we go. Hilma af Klint was from Sweden. She was born in Stockholm. She did study as an artist, and she was able to paint very, very lifelike landscapes, and she also did like botany. She did very lifelike pictures of flowers and things like that. But what she's most known for now is for her spirit work. Again, she got involved with spiritualism because of the death of her sister, and she got involved with it and formed her own group, Circle of Five, that worked with her. And she too started with the planchette and fooling around with automatic drawing and the planchette in her seances. She expanded into that, and she had a guide who would help to tell her what to do, and the guide led her hand. What's interesting about her work is that the spiritual work she's done is not as precise as when she was doing it with her conscious mind. So that's one of the reasons why they know that she had a spirit guide helping her, because the drawing style was different. Her pictures, these are very large pictures that she was putting together to create a temple. Standing in front of the pyramid image on the side there, you can feel the energy. You can feel the energy and the vibrations on it. The Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim Museum recently did a show of her work, and the work was never sold. It was held by her family. And so recently her family let the work be exhibited because she knew that people wouldn't understand the paintings during her own lifetime. So she waited until after she passed. On the different front, about the same time as she was working, we have the Bang sisters back here in America. Now, the Bang sisters, their painting and the Campbell brothers paintings just became known publicly in terms of American art history in the supernatural art exhibit that was put together by the Minneapolis Museum. And what the sisters would do, this picture of the gentleman with the beard is a guide. They would take the canvas, put it in front of a window, and the images would materialize on the canvas, just like a Polaroid picture would materialize on the paper. Slowly but surely, the image would appear. If the image wasn't perfectly right for the sitter, and the sitter suggested something, usually the paintings changed by the time the sitter got it home. The Campbell brothers also did precipitated painting, and these are two of theirs. They did historical figures. The picture of the gentleman in the white robes is Azor, their spirit god, and this was a picture that was loaned to the Minneapolis Museum. Both of these pictures reside in Lilydale. If you come to visit, they're in the hotel there. Precipitated painting is something we haven't seen until recently. I say with the work of Gary Mannion, he's kind of brought it back to us. But it's different. It's not the same as the Bank Sisters and the Campbell Brothers work. Getting more into contemporary, well-known history of artists, we have Wassily Kandinsky. And Kandinsky was probably one of the most important spiritual artists from the turn of the century. He wrote the book concerning the spiritual in art that tried to place art in a spiritual context. He was very influenced by Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, and all of that work, and that work influenced his books. He too was influenced by the work of Besant and Leadbeater, who were Theosophists, and their work, The Thought Forms. Kandinsky wanted to make the unseen world visible. What people have to remember is that abstract art wasn't about just squiggling lines on a page. It was about trying to show vibrations or things that we could not see with our normal eyes, that this was the unseen world and they wanted to show it. This particular painting, The Woman in Moscow, is important because the woman in the center, who's kind of in a Minoan pose here, is supposed to represent Madame Blavatsky. And up in the sky, you can see kind of a spirit figure, a gentleman with a halo or aura around his head. So there are definitely spiritual concepts being shown in this work. Paul Klee, also another one. Paul Klee and Kandinsky were both very much a part of the Bauhaus movement in the 1930s. And Klee was known as the mystic of the Bauhaus. And what people don't realize about the Bauhaus, they hear about how it did all kinds of industrial types of things. But the reality is that the Bauhaus had a very strong spiritual side to it. And the spiritual side, especially in their teaching, was not really carried over into the United States. What you got was the formal influences that they had, but they didn't get the spiritual influences. So when you were taught Bauhaus principles, that was totally neglected in my own education because the Bauhaus work is still being taught today. It was very interesting. And Klee was very important. He used psychic and emotive qualities of color in his work. Kuka also was a very important spiritualist medium. He was a working medium. He made a living as a working medium. He believed in telepathic vibrations that, like Rider, paint and images could exude vibrations to the receiver, to the person getting the message. So he was trying to communicate messages through the colors that he was painting. And it wasn't just the shapes, it was the feelings that you get from the colors and looking at the paintings, the colors in combination with each other. So he wanted you to look at it and feel it, very much so. The Canadian group of 7 can be related to the Hudson River School because the Canadian group of 7 were landscape artists. They were in Canada and they wanted to really create a school of Canadian painting, unique painting style just for the country of Canada. And what they did was, many of them were commercially in an art studio, but they would go out into the Canadian wilderness and they would paint. And they would paint the snow and trees and all kinds of natural forms that they saw in the wilds of Canada. Tom Thompson started the group, and he's the kind of founding father. However, he died rather young in a canoeing accident when he was out doing one of his painting trips. Lauren Harris was a wealthy person. He was the only one that I believe didn't have to work for a living. And Lauren Harris created, the first picture is Tom Thompson, the second one is Lauren Harris. Lauren Harris is very important because Lauren Harris, after being part of the group of 7, went to Southwest in the United States and became part of a group called the Transcendental Painters. I don't have any of their work here, but they're another group that worked very much with spiritual ideas and spiritual concepts, and Lauren Harris. We should note that these artists also, many of them were spiritualists. Hudson River School, Canadian Group of 7, all of them were spiritualists. Kandinsky was exposed to it, and Clay were all exposed to concept of spiritualism. And now we move, I'll say, I can take, I didn't look in the chat room if there's any questions about the earlier, whoops. Oh, no, I'm not going to get the chat room. I'm going to get the slideshow. Okay. The second part of this slideshow is about psychology and art. And this is one way, too, that you can really think that all art is spiritual. And this is a portrait by Jean Defay. And Defay, I'm probably not pronouncing it right. I don't know French. He collected art from mediums, psychiatric hospital patients, and children. What they were trying to do is they were tired of the way art was depicted in the schools and the academies, and they wanted to find a pure art, an art that really represented more of human emotion, an art that was not influenced by the schools or the institutes or culture as it was. So he looked and went to the mental hospitals and went to mediums to see their work. And out of that, art and mental ailments, came a whole series of new art called outsider art. Originally, outsider art was not really considered part of the art history establishment. However, today, outsider art, or art brut, as they say, is considered in art history, and there have been museum shows about all of these. But there were hundreds and hundreds of pictures collected from the mediums and from the psychiatric patients of all their work. And trance mediums also tend to fall partially into this category. Outsider art was used to describe art that has a naive quality to it. It was considered to be purer or more naive than the traditional standard art being created by artists at the time. It was produced often by people who had absolutely no training or conventional strictures or structures of art production. They had no idea what they were doing. Some of these works were created by mediums, people who had visions at one point in their life or another that told them to paint. And so they were inspired to paint by spiritual sources. And this especially is true of Madge Gill. She was controlled by my interest, who was her spirit guide and teacher. At first, they tried to put Madge into an insane asylum because that's what they did. Unfortunately, at that time, a lot of mediums were put into mental hospitals because they were considered deranged and not mediums. However, Madge Gill got a doctor who understood that her visions were coming from spiritualism and a spiritual intent, so they did not hospitalize her. And she was able to continue to do her work. And her work is very intricate, and when you look at some of the images inside, you'll see faces inside faces inside faces. She also worked very largely, and her work is now being exhibited today with outsider art. Lesage, Austin Lesage, he's a very interesting character. At the age of 35, he began to read books on spiritualism and attended seances. He heard a voice in his mind that told him that he would someday become a painter. He began to attend spiritual sessions, and as a path to communicate with the deceased, among them his younger sister Mary. Again, it was a relative that passed away who inspired him to do this kind of work. This is a story we see over and over again with a lot of these spiritual mediums. And he was very interesting because he worked as a miner, and as his experience in a mine, he would paint from the bottom up, like he was doing layers and layers and layers up on the painting, like you would coming up from a mine. They have a lot of Egyptian kind of motifs to them. They are very intricate, and he would just draw them. There would be no plan in advance. He would just draw these paintings. Again, Launay, he had spirit voices which guided his hands and helped him to create the drawings that he did. Laurie Pigeon was another one. Her automatic images were at first thought to be chaotic and rambling, and eventually they began to include figurative images. She too is considered an outsider artist. And then we get into psychiatry, mediumship, and art. And this is where it starts to get very interesting. In my book, I also spend a lot of time making a relationship between psychology and spiritualism. Most of the early psychologists, especially Jung, were all studying mediums. They thought that by studying mediums, they could understand the mind better. So they went to seances. William James studied Mrs. Piper. They all studied the mediums, trying to understand the way the mediums' minds worked. And then eventually it came out to the idea of disassociation. And Stanley Krippner has done a lot about dissociation and art, and he studied all of the mediums from Brazil. And there are a lot of them that I don't have mentioned here, but there are a lot of spirit art mediums from Brazil who did trance paintings during their time. And they are excellent, beautiful works. They would try to bring through the spirit of different types of deceased artists. And in their work, they would try to reflect a little bit of the style of that artist that was inspiring them. And dissociative experience may play an important role in understanding not only the art, but also mediums, because Krippner was able to explain that dissociation was not a mental illness. The dissociative state is something that people enter. It's like the creative flow state, where the medium goes into this kind of altered state. They lose a sense of time and space, and they just do the work, and they just paint on things. So the medium is similar, that the medium will dissociate and connect with the spirit link or the spirit person, bring through the information, but they're not using their conscious mind at the time they're doing it. So it's a split between the conscious mind and what's going on here with the disassociation. Trance art, here's a picture of Jose Medrado working on a trance painting. The trance artist would put all kinds of, usually paints around them. Some would paint with their hands. Jose does use a paintbrush at times. Maria Gertrudis, who also is a trance artist, paints with her hands and her feet. She will sit there with her hands doing one painting and working on another painting with her feet. And what they do, which is interesting, is these spirit artists don't do the paintings for money. They will auction their paintings off after they've done them. And then all of the money goes to a Brazilian charity, usually a charity for orphans and children. And Jose Inga is a friend of Jose's. He travels around the world for free doing this on his vacations because he's had another job the whole time he's been doing it. When we go back a little bit in history, David Duguid, he's known pretty much in England in mediumship circles, and he worked with a spirit that was a Dutch painter born in 1636. He worked under the pseudonym Marcus Baker. And Duguid, his pictures were a little bit smaller. He would go into a trance state and paint these little drawings for the people present at the seance. The interesting thing about some of Duguid's drawings were that some of the landscapes he painted were not recognized by British people, but they were recognized by Americans. So we see there's definitely was some spirit help in this with his work. Marjan, I'm not going to say this right, Gawinski, he was discovered to be medium for telekinesis and teleplastics. He also worked as a poet and improviser. He worked in a trance-like state, and he is a kind of unknown spirit artist. Again, this is Jose Medrado's painting. This is the painting he did for me of my grandmother. It's one of the few spirit art paintings that actually is evidential. That does happen, and it's happened to other trance artists as well. And you can see Jose doing his work on YouTube. If you type his name into YouTube, you can find images of him working. As I said, in addition to art, psychologists studied mediums, and there is a relationship here between the medium and the art and the psychology. It's interesting, the halo that envelopes the concept of art reverses the devotion it has in times. Oops, I'm losing this. The art is psychologically motivated as well as spiritually motivated. And we see that it deals with psychic needs of the artist. Bordiger was an art critic at the turn of the century, and he was aware of the spiritual influence of art, and he was aware of the work that was done during Der Blue Rider with Kandinsky and all of them. But we see too that on the psychological side of it, Pierre Genet, William James, Theodore Flournoy, Carl Jung, all attended seance, all understood spiritualist philosophy, and all understood the importance of the relationship between spirit and art. Genet, he studied mediums and was Jung's teacher in Paris. It should be noted that when Jung worked with Genet in Paris, Jung is also an artist. He would do landscape paintings when he was there. And Genet was the first to make the relationship between the idea of dissociation and trauma and that idea. And they also started to change the concept of automation. Instead of just automation with the planchette, in a spiritual context, they began to look at automatic drawing as a representation of the subconscious mind. And this was very important in the work of surrealists. And there was a connection between the surrealists and the psychologists because some of the surrealists studied medicine as well as doing their art. And the surrealists actually did their own kind of seance work where they would dissociate and try to bring through automatic drawings. They would also use dream therapy and try to bring through ideas through their dreams. And if you look at this, at the surrealist art, you can see it is the subconscious mind at play, trying to bring through ideas to the conscious state. William James was an important person with this too. James was the first person in the United States to teach classes in psychology, and he oscillated between the idea of studying human nature and his contribution to science, religion, and religion as being supernatural. He was very much interested in trying to understand whether messages were coming from the spirit world and deceased relatives or not. For 25 years, he studied Mrs. Piper. At the end of his life, he was still on the fence in regard to the spiritualist interpretation of facts. A lot of these people, they did agree that telepathy could be proved, but they couldn't prove that spirit communication with the deceased could be proved. And his writings influenced the surrealists and also the future of psychology. Psychology itself was really founded on these ideas that these men were studying in terms of mediums. Fournier is a very interesting person. He found that using the seance setting in experimentation with mediums was beneficial to their research, like many of them. He believed in telepathy, clairvoyance, telekinesis, materializations. He himself was a spiritualist who was looking for inescapable proofs of life after death. But his big contribution to this work was his book From India to the Planet Mars, where he was studying the work of a medium who claimed she was in communication with the planet Mars. She would go into an altered state, bring through messages from the planet. She had images of what was like on the planet Mars, and she also had a whole language that was supposed to be Martian, that was visual. And she became the muse, or the founding muse for the surrealists. So there was a relationship between Fournier and the spiritualists. Her name was Helene Smith, and Fournier relied on a method of detached observation to record the data, and he tried to be non-judgmental about what he did. The top here is a picture from Mars that she drew, and the bottom image is the language, the Martian language. He was unable to provide a rational explanation for all of the things that he was able to see in his observations. A lot of them found out, but they couldn't conclusively say that there was spirit communication. Now, Jung. And Jung is very important because, as I said, not only was Jung a psychologist, he was also an artist. And his work, especially the Red Book that's becoming much more popular today, showed his religious search through imagery on his quest for trying to bring together science and religion. Jung's initial dissertation was on his cousin, a medium, and it was all about mediumship. When he first began to describe his work, he was using spiritualist terms, but the psychological community rejected that. So then he spent his life trying to come up with psychological kinds of terms to try to explain what he was doing. So his idea of the collective unconscious is the spirit world. His ideas his guide was also a spirit guide, although he doesn't put it in those terms. And he really tried to reconcile religion and science in his work. And you'll see that many of his concepts, like the unconscious, universal conscious, creativity, all relate to art and how we do art. And the idea is that art is spiritually inspired, and art is also inspired by the unconscious mind. So these two things really put art and spiritualism together. And as I said, his dissertation was about his cousin. He did extensive studying of mediums in trance. He also went to many, many seances. He encouraged people to use their waking fantasies and visual hallucinations as part of their work. He conducted experiments with automatic drawing. It wasn't until later, and Jung started to do this, he started to use images in his therapeutic practice. At first, when all of the artists, the mediums from the outsider art period, they wouldn't use the art as a therapy treatment. They just collected the art and they just looked at it and they didn't think, hey, this is going to give us some insight into the mind of the person who did it. It didn't come until later, till after Jung and all of that. And this picture is a picture from his Red Book. I don't know how many of you are familiar with his Red Book. The Red Book is actually an illustrated manuscript. It was a huge book that Jung put together with writing and drawings. The drawings are very intricate. They're very detailed. Many of them are in a circle in the shape of a mandala. Many of them have religious themes and concepts. They are available in posters. People can buy the posters. And I would suggest that you do take a look up his Red Book and see some of his art, because he truly was an artist as well as a psychologist. And here's another piece from his Red Book. They're all very allegorical and almost mystical. So he used his own personal visions and hallucinations or fantasies to create these images. And so that's what I do. I did it in 45 minutes.